What we're going to be talking about today is the paradigm. The paradigm is a pattern, a breakdown, an idea about the page, and the fact that the page itself has a genuine resonance with what we do in comics. There's a mindset of late that comics are an improvisational medium and are available and are a skill set available to anybody. And we're all entitled to believe that nonsense, but let us not forget it is nonsense. Comics has a vocabulary, it has a syntax, it has a language, and the writing of comics is not simply the script and text, but it's the collaboration between the writer and the artist. That the artist himself is, we can look for metaphors, either the director, the auteur, but for the most part, the writing of comics is defined by a template script and images with narrative value. And that's a subjective idea. It certainly is. There's no question about it. But you will know it when you see it. The material that we're going to be talking about today is the page as a unit of space as it represents time and the real estate of that page. The origins and source of this material was a lecture series I did at Marvel for about 7 years in the early aughts. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that there seemed to be a diminished understanding of telling a story visually. And we'll break down the 5 panels that make up the map. And then we'll talk some more about how that applies in real life. Before we start, are there any questions about what I've said here today? Any thoughts, any observations? I might be insulting to some of your tastes, but don't hold it against me. I'm naturally insulting. I have a tendency to condescend because I'm kind of an obnoxious old motherfucker. And I have, Ellen has a question. Yes.
As a point of reference, what would you call out as an example of something you think exemplified your taste or your style, what you think exemplifies the ideal comic? Do you have anything you can point out?
Well, I mean, for me, I think the comics reached its pinnacle in the early 1950s with EC. And I'm not talking about the science fiction books or the monster books. I'm talking about Mad and the crime, Mad, the war books and the crime books. They were adolescent because they were still aimed at a young teen audience, but they demonstrated the potential for the form that ultimately was decapitated by the advent of the comics code. Most of the, what we're going to be talking about here is mainstream comics. I'm not talking about the autobiographical material. I don't much care about that work for the most part, because for the most part, for me, it strikes me as narcissistic junk. And I try to avoid that in my own work. I like genre material. I always have, but when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a superhero artist. And by the time I became a working professional, my skill set wasn't up to the work. I wasn't good enough. So I had to find other things to do. And by the time my skill set caught up with the material, I wasn't interested in superhero material. As much as I love Jack Kirby and all that work and Steve Ditko as a kid, it has no impact whatsoever in my adult life and hasn't for many, many years. I'm a veteran of 50 years of comics. And at least 40 of those years have been spent not being at all interested in what was being done in the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man. So there you go. Chuck, let's take a look at that first image, shall we? Okay. Now this is something we call the paradigm, and I take no credit for it. This was given to me by someone else, who I'm sure got it from someone else. It basically looks at the building blocks, the visual contents of the page. One of the things we discussed later on in the second and third lecture is how small the page is, and that's a concept that's often very difficult to get across to writers. Writers tend to think that the comic book page is as big as they'd like it to be, because they're missing out on a number of the graphic factors that make up a comic book page. The comic book page has to be reasonably clear, reasonably fluid, and have pictures of narrative value, but also, and this is where the subjective shit comes in, has to be beautiful. And by beauty, I do not mean symmetrical. I do not mean lovely. I mean structurally sound, with a series of panels that support themselves and each other. There's a lot of thought in comics discussion about narrative storytelling using eye lines and stuff. My feeling is that the definition of eye line storytelling in comics is hooey. It is hogwash. It makes no sense. It's nonsense. It doesn't really exist. It's a justification. It's kind of like when you were in school and you were asked to do a composition and you had to tell your teacher what the theme was. Theme is something that comes along after you've figured out what you're writing about. Theme is not something you start out to do, unless of course it's man's humanity to man, which is always my theme. That the narrative, the kind of narrative that is derived from eyeline storytelling is there after the fact. Rather, I believe that what we're talking about here is the pattern and relationships of panel to panel. This structure that you're seeing here was where I started. It was the first time I had a glimmer of an understanding of the architecture of the page. And you look at the page itself, it has a very architecturally sound idea. It's like a door. There's a ground plane on the bottom, and on top there's a lintel, and there are these three vertical panels in the middle. Let's talk about that first panel. First panel is a horizontal shape, and it's an establishing shot. Establishing shots are, generally speaking, best served by the horizontal shape, because establishing shots address landscape, place, and horizontal shapes define the concept of landscape in the same way that vertical shapes define the concept of portrait. The horizontal shape established here is based on 3 layers of depth. The culture in which we exist is based on 3. There's a reason there's a Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And really, you only need 2. And our jokes, our narratives, our acts are 3 acts. And we have 3 layers of depth. We have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And the amateur is going to approach almost anything from the perspective of symmetry and central placement. That is fine for church and for majesty. But in terms of narrative, it's better to deal with things in an off balance and almost opposed to the expectations way. If you take a look at what we've done here, those 3 layers of depth. The foreground is let's just call it a glade and a tree. Our 2 figures, these clothespin sized figures, are middle ground, and in the back is a mountain, a house. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what it is. The professional understands that much of what happens in narrative is a kind of subjective voyeurism. The panel border around the panel does not exist for the action and content of the panel. Once you objectify that panel border, you enter the realm of meta. And meta is something you're perfectly entitled to do, but it will occasionally distract and confuse the reader. Your job is to keep the reader on his toes, her toes, delighted, but not necessarily to confuse unless that's your purpose in the first place. So let's look at the placement of elements in this shot. Now, I'm a theater goer. I'm a very old school traditional theater goer. And in the theater, there's something called the proscenium arch. The proscenium arch in old school was designed to look like a picture frame. And its function was to divide the audience, to separate the audience from the action on the stage, but also to create a sense of voyeurism, a participation, a substitute, a representative of the audience in the context of the image. The panel border does that, but there's also the use of that foreground tree to create a foreground element past which we are sort of almost voyeuristically observing the action taking place. The horizontal panel is extremely difficult to design for because it is by nature placid and horizontal. The best served, excuse me, the best service to that horizontal panel is one of a series of diagonals. And you will notice that our 2 figures, let's call them Dick and Jane, are off to the right. That is where your action is primarily going to take place. Here now again, you must understand that much of what I'm saying here is my opinion. You can do with it as you will, as you choose. But I believe that as a Western culture, which reads from left to right, that the left side of an image is home, whereas the right side of an image is adventure, is the world outside, to be visited, to be seen. And that when you have a character in motion, you are best served by having that character move from left to right. I had an assistant, very talented guy, better draftsman than I'll ever be, who consistently would draw characters walking and place them in the center of the picture, which meant that they really hadn't gotten anywhere yet. The journey of narrative is to introduce your characters in such a way that the narrative has already begun and that you're catching up with the characters in the context of that narrative. And your responsibility is to catch up with them and to maintain with them. Okay? This is why our characters are on the right side of the panel. The central axis is there in your head, but should always be dealt with as something to be done to the side of, and preferably in my case, to the right. The background is there to basically provide something our characters that operate against. The information provided in this panel is extremely profound. You get two characters, and if you have a little bit of skill, you can convey some body language. You get a sense of what those characters' relationship is to the world in which they function and exist. And you've got a surrogate in that tree and that copse in the foreground that is playing you in the picture. Okay? Questions, thoughts, observations? I look forward to hearing from you. Ellen, what do you got?
How much of that would you consider the responsibility of the writer to lay out in the script versus the artist to make a call on when they read it?
Great question. One of the things you'll be getting when this is over, you'll be getting a folio. And in the folio is an essay I wrote about writing in comics. And one of the things that has to be borne in mind is that writers, for the most part, if they could, would draw their own stuff, but they can't because they lack the skill set. And frequently they tend to think that they're thinking visually, but they're not. Anecdotally, I will frequently work with writers. I used to occasionally work with writers who thought they were writing at me with very little understanding of actually what I do. My scripts go precisely to what you're talking about, because my scripts are all about panel shape and size. Most writers do not think in these terms. It is the responsibility of the artist, in my opinion, that the artist is not an illustrator. The comic book artist uses illustrative techniques to provide narratives, pictures with narrative strategy to comply and work with the writer's concept. More often than not, you're going to find yourself with a script that is a template that your responsibility will be to transcribe and transliterate a series of literary ideas into pictures with narrative value. I've been lucky enough for most of my career to work with writers who are flexible and plastic enough to accept this. I've also worked with some of the biggest schmucks alive, okay? And there are circumstances where it's important to understand that you're the last man on the relay team, that the letterer and the colorist are going to be complimenting your stuff, not the writers. And that your job is to make sure that what the writer is trying to say is being said, not necessarily in this particular syntax and the way he said it, but in a way that's narrative clear. When I did, for example, when I did Satellite Sam, in those 15 issues of the book, there might have been 6 pages that I did exactly what Matt described in terms of the panel layout and panel page layout. 6 out of out of what, 200 some odd pages. Because there are elements of balance and pattern that a writer cannot see, that an artist's responsibility is to always see. Does that make sense? Anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So to clarify, as a writer, so I'm a writer primarily, not an artist. So when I'm writing a panel, if I have an opinion on something, I should take it with a grain of salt that that's going to get removed. And in most cases, actually leave it more open for the artist to interpret.
I think you can have it both ways.
Okay.
I think you can, as I said, I mean, if you'll be emailing me after this, okay, you'll get my email address and all this shit. And one of the things that you, if you're interested, I'll send you a script of mine so you can see what I do, how I do it. And I'm really anal. I'm incredibly OCD with this shit. I'm very specific. But my specificity has less to do with the description of action than the amount of space allotted to the action itself. And frequently, anecdotally, if a writer asks me what I feel like drawing, I'm no longer interested in working with that writer. Because that implies that I operate from a perspective of, gee, I feel my muse touching me today. This is not job. I am a professional. This is my career. It is not muse based. And your job, I think, is to deliver as much as you possibly can, not write yourself and your artist into a hole, and be available to potential changes that may or may not work, and argue it out. Because it is not a proprietary relationship with the two of you. It is a conspiratorial and collegial relationship, and that relationship has to be maintained. That make sense?
Yeah, to piggyback on that really quick, Ellen, because I just want to say that in Paradigm 2, we do talk a little bit more about scripting. In Paradigm 3, we talk a lot about scripting, whereas, definitely come back to that.
Paradigm 2 puts this into practice, and Paradigm 3 is a serious breakdown of going from that German idea to a finished page. And I get really deeply granular. So there you go. Anyone else? May I go on? I will go on. Okay. Panel 2 is the two-shot full figure. And I say full figure for a reason. There's no cropping. We get everything. We get feet, we get heads. And the reason for this is that frequently artists don't think about how to crop images. And that you need to occasionally see, if you look at that first panel, there's ground plane between the bottom of those two characters' feet and the panel border. That ground plane is really important because you need distance, you need some detachment. The sense of surrogacy and the sense of voyeurism of the presence of the reader in the material is something that has to be enhanced. You are inviting the reader to participate in the experience. And one of the ways you do that is to create space between the reader and the characters, which the reader can then fill in. That changes later on this page as we get to it, but you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, if we've done our job in panel 1, we can think of this in that rare moment where I actually apply the use of cinematic terminology as a truck-in shot. It's take those two figures and done pretty much the same thing. Now, frequently I find, now Ellen, are you working professionally? Who are you working for?
I just secured a contract with Legendary Entertainment's comic department.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. My experience at the major comic book companies, at DC and Marvel both, is that you have editors on staff at both houses who have never had any experience of actually making a comic book. And their editorial input is usually boiled down to literary reference and the occasional misapplication of film terminology and film technique. Comics have a somewhat shared DNA with movies and television, but they are a very distinctly different medium. They are, in the first place, they are deeply static. You have to imply motion, imply action, and I'm not talking about speed lines. I'm talking about the presence of implicit motion. At any rate, these two figures are, like as I say, a two-shot full figure. They give us facial expression, costume, body language. And further, if we've done our work well, you can do a vignette. By a show of hands, who has the Wallace Wood 22 panels that always work? Ellen, you got to get it. Trust me. It's on the net. It was made many, many years ago by Larry Hama. Larry was a guy who was an editor at Marvel for years. He was a writer at Marvel. He's a really good artist. He's responsible for the contemporary G.I. Joe franchise. He's a great guy. And he was working for Wallace Wood, and he put together this great page of 22 panels that always work. And it's snarky. It's Woody at his snarkiest. And it is an absolute imperative for all talent, because it's basically 22 panels will always work when writers give you really boring shit to draw. That's sort of the implication of the piece. But what we're talking about here is that vignette. A vignette is a shape unto itself that supports itself, that does not have a panel border, that background or artwork that ends at a panel border that doesn't exist for these characters. There's an artist who I revere enormously, a guy that I regard as the single most influential comic book talent to come into the business in the past 45 years. His work has been picked over and influenced so many secondary talents to him that it's astonishing. And he constantly objectifies the panel border with insets. And for me, it's sort of like the equivalent of taking a cheese slicer and running across the top of a Velveeta. The characters seem to disappear into a non-existent panel border. And it obviates this sense of volume and shape. I invite you strongly to consider, if you're going to do a vignette, that the shape must support itself in a silhouette. And by silhouette, I don't mean a black filled in outline. I mean the shape of the image itself. Does that make sense? Questions, thoughts, observations? No, nothing? I haven't challenged you in any way? No one's pissed off yet? Okay.
I'm not pissed off, but can you go over the...
Is your name pronounced Logosu?
Logosu.
Logosu, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, can you just go over the vignette one more time?
Sure. It's an important. This is, again, this is in the realm of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The artist I'm talking about is a better draftsman than I'll ever be, but it's a graphic choice that doesn't work for me. That if you've got a vignette, should have white space behind it. Okay. Because when we're finished with this page, where we're talking about here, we'll talk about white space. The idea that these two figures exist against a blank field. It's one of the things that comics can do that movies and television can't do without taking you jarringly out of the idea. You will frequently have pages of comics, where, I'm not talking about the lazy assholes who don't do backgrounds at all. I'm talking about where you can literally drop a background out to create a silhouette. And the silhouette here is two figures, let's just say in full color, against a white space. And they are unto themselves. They are in and of themselves. They do not, there's no panel border around them. If their figures kiss where the live art area is, there's no panel border to end it. We live in a full bleed universe now. When I got into comics, you were 10 by 15 and that was it. There was no bleed. If you broke out, you took the serious chance of getting cropped. When you look at a comic book original today, there are 3 lines. There's live art area, there's crop area, there's full bleed. Okay? And you can really play with that for effect. It gives you air and space. When I first came back to comics in the early aughts, and this was an issue, I went out of my mind. It was like, oh, I was overboard. And I've calmed down dramatically. And I'm very conscientious about doing full bleed, where I choose to do a full bleed, whether I bleed top, bottom, side. Okay. But that vignette shape, when you see do you have the Woody page or not? You one of the people who do not have it? You have it? Take a look at what that shot he does of the car, of the figures, okay? You'll see what I'm talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks, man. All right. Any further questions?
I have a question.
Thanks, Jonathan. What do you got?
I'm thinking it's almost like on a stage when you have the spotlight that isolates the actor in a soliloquy or something. Would you?
Yeah, well, what you're talking about is a down in one. I was listening to Kiss Me Kate yesterday, the original Cast album, and probably it's a great Cole Porter score. And there's a very uncharacteristic song in the show called "Brush Up Your Shakespeare." Brush up your Shakespeare, start quoting him now. And the whole function of that song is to give a moment for the cast, for the stagehands to go behind the curtain and change the sets. And these are 2 guys performing down in front of the curtain, doing a soft shoe number to basically distract the audience. But yes, that the down in one effect is directly applicable. I mean, anecdotally, I'm much more stage influenced than I am by movies. Years ago, I was in London. I was waiting for my room in my hotel to be gotten ready, and I found myself sitting next to this older guy. And I turned over. It was Stephen Sondheim. Okay, and I'm a huge theater queen, enormously so. And I turned to him and I said, Mr. Sondheim, I'm a comic book artist of some renown. And unlike many of my colleagues who were deeply influenced by professional wrestling, I'm profoundly influenced by musical theater, and I hate my mother too. And got a big laugh. It made my day. It was fabulous. So theatrical technique, the contrivance of theater, the idea of footlights is a real big part of the way I think about a page. I'm also a great believer in the resonance that exists between silent film and the kind of makeup and acting and the form of acting available in silent film, kabuki, and pornography as it applies to comics, because there's an overstatement in visual metaphor in kabuki and in silent film and in porn, the makeup, the overpresentation that is very applicable to what we do in comics. I'm not talking about loci and all this other stuff. I'm talking the general narrative storytelling we tend to overdo, and melodrama has its place in comics, much more so than in television or movies. Does that make sense? Yes? Can I go on? I will. I'll go on. Okay. Panel 3 is a 2-shot medium close. And this is one of the things that's reflected on Woody's page. If we go back to panel 2, or even panel 1, we have our 2 figures, they're Dick and Jane. I'm old. I learned to read with fun with Dick and Jane. Okay. These 2 white Anglo-Saxon Protestant children living in a suburb that I'd never seen. I grew up in Brooklyn in a tenement, so they were alien creatures to me. But they had a dog named Puff or some shit, whatever it was. But Dick and Jane is what I call these people. So Dick is on the left, Jane is on the right. Now you'll note that one of those misapplied cinematic techniques that frequently are voiced out to you by editors is the 180-degree line. The 180-degree line is a theory, is a cinematic trope, which says that if you've got 2 figures talking, you cannot shift the camera to reverse them in presence on the screen. That's great for the movies, but it's bullshit for comics. It just doesn't play. Okay, you can do whatever you want. There is no 180-degree line. Fuck these people! How dare they interrupt me? Right? Come on! It's your time, right? Come, Ellen. What? I mean,
ridiculous.
Please.
I mean,
they
cut
should
the phone lines.
die. They should die and taste their own blood, right? Okay, good. Dick. So now I was distracted. So basically, what we're talking about here is the framing element of a figure in the foreground. Now, the headshot in that foreground is Dick. The woman in the back is Jane. And the foreground figure of Dick is obviously become more graphic by dint of cropping. And the function of that shape is to the same function as the tree and foreground copse in panel 1. It's a framing element. It's larger than Jane, but by its cropping and by its becoming more graphically a shape, it lets the reader know intrinsically that it's Jane's story we're telling on this page, that she is the focus of what we're talking about on the page. You'll notice that she's a bit cropped out, but even with the cropping out, her facial expression is what matters to the image. Okay? This is something I use all the time. It is an imperative technique because I feel deeply that so much of what is lost in contemporary comics is the concept of voyeurism and surrogacy, of putting the reader in the material. Thoughts, observations, questions, points of reference? I welcome your questions, I truly do. It gives you an opportunity to be even cleverer than I am. No? Okay. Fine. I'm not hurt. You know, my feeling, I only have one good one left, is not hurt. It's okay.
I do have a
what,
question.
Ellen?
Sorry.
You're
I have a
scared.
question.
Oh, wait.
Sorry.
Yes.
I do have a question. It's a little, I'm not sure exactly how to word it, but the idea of voyeurs.
Having heard me speak for the past half hour, you really feel the need to be restrained? Honestly.
Come on. Different standards.
Yeah.
You mentioned this idea of voyeurism and giving them a place in the panel. do you think it's important for that to be some big overarching metaphorical item, or just like, oh, there's a tree here and we are looking from the perspective of the tree?
You're getting ahead of me, because that's what gets dealt with in the next panel.
Ah,
Look at you. Look at you. Oh. Okay.
That's my bones.
I think you raise a really valid issue, and again, that issue comes up. Panel 4 is the tight close-up, and because it's Jane's story, that's Jane. Now, just in the amateur's perspective, a large close-up is identified by the uninterested reader, by the marginally interested reader, as a portrait. But the portrait itself here has a function. The function is to tell us how Jane feels about this, what's going on in the narrative that is this story on this page, how we as the reader should feel about that experience. And this is where we go right back to what Ellen was asking, which is to say, in as many cases as possible, the character in that close-up should identify subjectively with the reader. Anecdotally, some years ago, I was on a panel at a convention in the Midwest. And there were two guys who were discussing a book they'd just done that had just been come out in trade. And it sounded really interesting. The franchise was interesting and it had a nice hook to it. I bought the trade, 5 issues, and read it on the way home. And in the course of this 5 issues, everything was sort of vaguely brown sepia taupe. The characters themselves didn't really physically relate to each other, panel by panel. There was no sense of pattern on the page as to why this panel was this big, why this panel was this big, that the panels themselves were all sort of arbitrary. And most significantly, in those 5 issues, there wasn't a single moment where any of the characters were interrelated subjectively with the reader. I'm not talking about that fourth wall breaking Deadpool bullshit. That's not what I mean. I mean literally identifying the reader. Now, one of the things you'll note, and well, I'll get to that at the bottom after we've gone through this, is that, well, again, I'll save that. Thoughts, questions about this? Points of reference, points of view. Because the bottom panel gets wrapped up really quickly, just so you know. The bottom panel is called the return. And it's basically pretty much the same as the top panel. It wouldn't really be a narrative. Since I don't know what the story's actually about, I haven't really taken that any farther than that. But what that bottom panel does is it brings us full circle to where the page began. So both in terms of point of view, in terms of fixed point of view, in terms of general deep space. And one of the reasons for doing this is to create the fact that the page is a scene in and of itself. That there's a punchline and a logic to the material. But before we go on to the examples, I want to point something out. Panel 1 and panel 5 are the same size. Panel 2, 3, and 4 are the same size. Those decisions are made not arbitrarily, not abstractly, but concretely. You impact and affect the way the reader reads the material by how you choose to scale the panels you're delivering. If you've got 4 panels across and they're all different sizes, if you didn't do it intentionally, it looks like a fucking accident. And accidents are not serving you well in the context of addressing a serious reader. Now, most readers of comics don't give a shit about what we're talking about here. They like guys with capes and masks and shit coming out of their eyes and shit. I don't care about that guy. You know, if that's the level of interest that a comic book reader brings to the material, he's more than welcome to read all the junk he wants to. But if you're addressing a reader who's got a serious interest in the language that he's reading, you owe it to yourself and to that reader to pay serious attention to not being arbitrary, but to make actual choices. Does that make sense? Clarity? Points of reference? Okay. 2. Another thing is, although that these panels are divided by black lines, white space. We go into this in much deeper detail later on in the second and third idea. But white space between the panels is an imperative because it means nothing. Black is the presence of everything. White is the presence of nothing. And you need to provide nothing for the reader between panels and panels So there's a moment of breath and intake. I will say it one more time, and you'll hear me repeat it again if you show up for 2 and 3. The page is tiny. And finally, before we go on, the amount of space in the context of comics, space represents time. The amount of space allotted to an action in a panel is directly related to the amount of time involved in the execution of that action. Questions? Thoughts? Is that clear? Does that make sense? Knut, what do you got? You got to unmute, pal. You're muted.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Frank Robbins. I'm a big fan of Frank Robbins and his Johnny Hazard work. And in the context of that, when he uses like establishing shots, he sometimes creates a sense of depth of space where you have several story beats in one panel. I'm curious as to how that relates to establishing shots. I mean,
Well, the
is
aspect
that
ratio,
too much in an establishing shot?
well, the aspect ratio, and
Story
right,
beat?
all right. Let me answer your question. The aspect ratio of the newspaper comic strip and a comic book are very different, and the intentional result of a newspaper page and a comic book page are very different. People who read newspaper strips, with obviously some exceptions, are casual readers. People who read comic books are enthusiasts. The language appears to be the same, but the functions are different. Newspaper strips are there to sell newspapers. Are there to sell eyes to advertisers. Comic book pages are there to sell comic book readers. And the available space on a page doesn't really allow you the kind of luxury that we're talking about with Robbins or Frank King or Roy Crane. I'm deeply influenced by those guys, but you'll notice that the technique used to sell the idea, anecdotally, look at it this way. The last great adventure strip was probably Mary Perkins on Stage. And it was a strip created by a guy who'd come up from comic books, as opposed to the guys who come up through the system of newspaper strips. And Mary Perkins on Stage was historical in that every Sunday page of Mary Perkins on Stage featured an establishing shot, usually of New York City, a skyline, which was done by Tex Blaisdell for Leonard. And the function of that was to set the tone, and also because there was the newspaper, the strip itself would be available to be done in a tabloid format and in a half sheet format, so that the panel itself could be divided. And I suspect, I would not be surprised to find out that the same is true of what you're talking about Robbins. Okay, does that make sense? Yes. Any thoughts before we go on?
You talk about this framing in terms of a single page, but if you were working with, a double page spread, could the door open on the first page and then close at the end of the second, or do you think it needs to open and close per page?
That's a pagination issue in real terms. It's the kind of thing where you can't do a surprise on an odd numbered page. Turn the page, you're surprised. Okay, so the structural format of a double page spread requires a kind of narrative. Are you talking about reading across the page from left to right across the page? Are you talking about reading a page and then page? Is it a single splash image? There's all sorts of possibilities. Mm-hmm. It's a real case by case basis.
Understood. But what you talk about here, where you say, when you're talking about the paradigm of opening on the establishing and then the return, if you were looking at a double page spread that is on it, could be down each page individually or across the entire thing on it, I guess the question would more apply to a situation when you read down one page and then the second page.
Well, I did back in the 70s, I loathed the portmanteau of graphic novels. It's just a bullshit phrase. It's nonsensical. but I did a number of things that fit that format, you know, with Byron Price and a couple of other people. And the Empire material that I did with Chip Delaney and the adaptation of The Stars and Vaccination were designed almost exclusively as double page spreads. And I found that the narrative design problems associated with doing the double page spreads were enough to convince me to stop doing that. I preferred the aspect ratio of the single page. In the early 90s, I did a revival of the Guy Gardner character in the Green Lantern franchise. And I used the technique you're talking about to introduce the world and my take on that world. And I used it in a ballad form. I repeated the same images for 4 double page spreads to create the idea that this is, you know, and then I went to something else. The problem with double page spreads by my standards is that they've been frequently misused by people who are interested in nothing but sensation. And I'm less interested in sensation than I am in sensibility. And so I'd be very cautious about thinking of material in double page spreads. Just be aware, be careful. And Chuck, let's go on and see some examples here. This is something I did in the 80s, which is exactly what we're talking about. You know, it's you got that establishing shot with that foreground element of the car, the 2 figures in the middle distance. Panel 2, two shot full figure. Panel 3, framing device. And in this case, the color. I mean, we are so spoiled today by computer coloring that, you know, when you were dealing with a 64 color palette in those days, you were grateful to be able to have a guy, in this case, one of my many wives, in charge of the color, and who really understood how to frame that her face in panel 3. And again, the return, you got that foreground element in the bottom panel. The action remains deep space. The panels are the same size. None of this is arbitrary. All of this is on purpose. Can we go on? A little more graphic approach to it. Here I am overwriting like a son of a bitch, and shamefully so. Why don't I just shut up? This is where I fell in love with my own voice, and B, just wouldn't listen to an editor who was afraid of me for some reason. But again, the same basic effect. This is work. I was 32 or 33 when I did this, and I had finally come into my own as a talent. I was so terrible before this, and this was the result of serious woodshedding, of figuring out the language of the material, because I have no talent per se. I have a skill set, and this is the result of that skill set. Just learning how to organize a page in such a way that was pleasing to look at, that had narrative value. Again, action and image. Next. A different placement of figures in the shape, but the same basic pattern. Okay. Here I am ignoring my own rule about the same size panels, but again, it's because I'm working in full bleed. I have no idea what I'm doing. This was that first attempt at full bleed stuff. But I worked hard, you know, and I tried all sorts of different stuff, and I strongly recommend you do the same. But again, remember that the story is what you're telling with the pictures. I have an assistant who, when he first came to work for me, tried to explain to me that pretty was enough. And I disabused him of this notion rapidly. Pretty is never enough. It's good to be pretty, but it's also good to be sound. Thoughts, questions, points of reference?
Sorry, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
So obviously, well, for me, my opinion is also that like rhythm between pages is important to change pace and not always have the same panel breakdown. So would you consider the paradigm you've demonstrated like the standard fallback solid always going to work? Or no, do you think
if you show up for paradigm 2, you'll see me completely deflate this notion and point out an entirely different direction to take.
Okay.
But what the point I'm making here is that these 5 panels are the building blocks. And if you're going to do this for a living, in my opinion, and my opinion is sound because I've been doing it for 50 fucking years, these are things to know how to use and how to do. And you were well served by those 5 ideas, okay? You organize them in different ways. For example, in paradigm 2, where we move beyond that paradigm, and I demonstrate that the establishing shot, the 2-shot full figure, the 2-shot medium close, and the close-up can be organized in a way that has nothing to do with the lintel, baseboard and verticals. When I was at Marvel, in my earliest career, I could not do horizontal imagery because they were so boring. All my pages were vertical, and it was because I could make interesting images out of basically slim, narrow vertical shapes. And Roy Thomas used to dismiss them as looking like keyholes. And then I went into my mail slot period. To this day, I will frequently do pages, as you'll see if you come back next week for Paradigm 2. I will do pages that are 4 horizontal panels stacked, same size, each one, same image, fixed POV with action adjusting, and insets that are visual equivalents of punchlines leading you from one panel to the next. But again, I am a graphic designer in the service of narrative. That's what I do. I'm not an illustrator. Okay. One more question. Hey, Logo.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about this this top panel. This is a little bit different from the other examples.
Yeah.
Where you have this this diagonal from the, I don't know what they call that, a piano cover, piano door, like breaking that up. So can you just talk a little bit more about the construction of that top panel?
Yeah, I mean, I drew it the assumption that the foreground elements would be colored in a more subdued way. That's my wife. Hold on. I'm in the middle of the thing. What's going on? I can't talk to you right now. I'm in the middle of the Zoom thing. Blame my wife. She's a smart and final, like I give a fuck. Don't tell her I said that. Shh. As I said, I originally drew this with the assumption. Don't yell at me. Don't judge me. I'm married. I'm very well. She owns my ass. That the foreground elements would be done in a subdued monochromatic way, but my colorist, who had his own ideas, went more decorative, and I was perfectly happy with it because even with all that decoration, those 2 central figures are bounced up against a nice pale colored shape. This was me taking advantage of the fact that I had achieved some muscle with doing Flag 2 years earlier and seeking out to do a very experimental comic book, and it flopped like a son of a bitch. Because the audience is not interested in having its perspectives challenged. It wants guys with shit coming out of their eyes. But I continue to work for an audience that doesn't exist. I'm having a pretty good time doing so. Does that answer your question in any way? I hope so. Is there any more to this, Chuck? Do we have anything else to look at? What's going on? Oh yes, we do, of course. That's right. And now this is where the application of that layout serves itself in terms of the fixed POV. We know what fixed POV means, yes? Does anyone not know what a fixed POV is? Hands raised for those who don't know what it means. Good, you all do. This is a page of 2 fixed POVs. We have 2 horizontal POVs, top and bottom, and a vertical. And what we do is we're playing with the eye. This is a demonically activated police car that has serious sexual issues in this story. And the use of this all predates Photoshop. It's all Xeroxes. Okay, me with an X-Acto knife, rubber cement, and spray mount, and then of course the use of lettering. You'll notice that the lettering serves to move the card from left to right, and you've got the action in the middle there of Centaur police officers smacking the shit out of a mob, while the foreground elements remain the same. And I am blessed to work with Ken Bruzenak, who is a very difficult, complex, and angry guy, just like me, with whom I have a profound affinity graphically. half of the time I will simply suggest an idea to him, and everything will just come to place. I mean, there's no reason why, for example, in those middle panels, those sound effects should fill the sky, but they do, and they really work for me. I have great faith in my colleagues and collaborators. And I feel that I spent an hour and a half on Facebook last night with my colorist who's in Bogota. We have a major language barrier between the two of us. But it was a spirited session of disagreement. And ultimately, it was my fault. The problem was something that I caused. So I was willing to take the fall for it and cover it. But I like working with people who can justify and explain why they do what they do. I have a distinct distrust for the arbitrary. And I'm a great believer in the idea that part of our job is to maintain conviction. Let's go on. Is that it? Is that it, Chuck? That is it. Okay.
That is it.
This is that piece about writing in comics that I talked about. Now, just to bring everything to a close, one of the things I always say about comics is there are 6 people involved in any comic book. There's an editor, there's a writer, there's an artist, there's a colorist, there's a letterer, and there's a reader. One of the things you've got to do, if you're actually serious about selling comic books to people, is to acknowledge the fact that the reader is a presence and a participant in the turning of the page. He is the engine that turns the page. Your job is to surprise, to delight, to challenge, and amuse. And frequently we forget that, and I mean, in the past couple of hours, I've been accused of being a snob and elitist, both of which I accept with all good grace, because I am a snob and I am an elitist. Accusing me of something, like, yeah, whatever, it's pretty obvious. But by the same token, I take the criticism and praise of the audience for which I work with no seriousness whatsoever, completely neutral. I tend to ignore the opinions of those who read the material that I produce, because their opinions more often than not say more about their feelings about the work than they do about the work itself. I would strongly encourage you, if you are serious about doing this, to not take neither praise nor blame seriously, to simply move forward and do the work. The audience, and again, anytime I hear anybody who says that they came to comics as a second choice, I don't buy it. Comics is a calling. It has more in common with the Jesuitry than anything else. And I mean, I was infected with comic books at the age of 4, and it's all I've ever wanted to do. And despite the fact of having no real talent, I became a pretty good comic book artist by dint of learning how to do it. And I was instructed by a mentorship that, I mean, I stand on the shoulders of 5 giants. And I think something has been enormously lost by the collapse of the transference of information from generation to generation. And it's important to me that I've always had an assistant. I was an assistant for many years. I have assistants, and my assistants all operate under the assumption that you will do better work for me than you've done for yourself. And that's the pledge I make to my assistants in every way, shape, and form. Any other questions? What else do we got? Come on.
Christian, you don't have a question? I think this is the first time Christian's been on here without a question.
Come on. Babies.
And he's muted.
Christian is talking. Unmute yourself, Christian.
Sorry about that. Hey, Howie.
Hey, Howie.
And thank you, Chuck.
Whoa. Howie?
Sorry.
Howie?
Howard. Mr. Chaykin.
No, Howard.
Howard.
You really do not know me. No.
You know, I not only do I know
you just opened a can of worms.
Not only do I know you, but I hung out with your wife's daughter when she was like 16 years old.
Kelly?
Yeah.
No shit.
Yeah. So
wow.
Yeah, you and I have met. It's been a while. But how are you, Howard?
Your name sounded familiar. Okay. All right.
It's been a while. I have so many questions that I would like a breakdown of just a quick kind of a quick synopsis, if you will, of part 2.
Yeah, to a certain extent, Paradigm 2 will take the basic, the building blocks we talked about, these 5 panels, and rearrange them and organize them in a way that achieves the same goal with a different set of subjective duties. Does that make sense?
Has anyone asked you, Howard? Has anyone asked Howard about the 9 grid or the 16 grid?
No, I don't think so.
I use it quite a bit, but for very specific effect. I use it for transitional conversation talk material. I rarely use it for strong narrative movement. I mean, I could never have done what Dave Gibbons did with Alan Moore and The Watchmen. You know, I think to an odd degree, no one talks about how much that book owes to what Kurtzman was doing at EC. You know? But the visual language of the material for me is that I envy a guy like David Aha or Chris Somney, who can do a 9-panel page of strong narrative. I can't get that much into those tiny panels to convey narrative. I'm working on a book right now in collaboration with a writer I really like working with, who calls out shots differently than I do, but I respect and understand his shot calling. I say that makes perfect sense. And he will occasionally ask for the kind of page breakdown you're talking about. And my own instincts run against it because I learned how to do what I do primarily from Gil Kane, Gray Morrow, and Wallace Wood. And to a profound extent, those guys were involved, and particularly Gil in his case, with the money shot, with the idea of building toward a larger image. That a lot of that is that hyperbole of his work, but whereas I'm not hyperbolic, I still like the idea of a largish image surrounded by smaller images, as the same size 9-panel grid. I've used the 9-panel grid occasionally in Hey Kids for like the same way that Norman Rockwell did on the cover of those phone books. You know, the transfer of information from character to character by Tom. And I really like that idea. But come back for Paradigm 2 and 3 because we will definitely get into this kind of shit deeply.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll say hi to Kelly for you.
Thanks.
And definitely head out to your comic shop and pick up the new volume of Hey Kids.
Hey Kids 3. It's pretty splendid. You know, it speaks directly against anybody who thinks we're all a bunch of comic book loving guys. And the nice thing is about the second volume of Hey Kids is it's filled with avatars of people who aren't dead yet. So I'm about to get my ass kicked when I hit a convention. Yeah.
Are you going to hit any conventions this year, Howard?
I am, because I'm a fucking moron, and I'm going to go visit the plague. I'm booked and scheduled to hit Kansas City in August, Portland, Oregon in September, Baltimore in October, and Dallas in November. And I may be doing Denver sometime this year as well. I'm deeply vaccinated. I'm of the belief that if I'm vaccinated and inoculated, I can't simply hide under a bushel. Many of my colleagues are not going out until 2022. Maybe I'm an idiot, but I miss people. You know, I mean, as much as I'm a difficult figure and all that other stuff, I like the idea of engagement at shows. I also like the idea of potentially finding colleagues that I can eat with that evening and complain. You know, there's a lot to be said for that. You know, okay. So that's it. You see me, if you hear I'm going to be at a show, come by. You know, I'm fabulous in person. I'm well groomed with this Old Testament thing that I've got going on.
Do we have time for one more question?
Christian, what do you got? You want to go out with you? You're anchoring.
Thank you. The lost art of the partial script, the plot script as opposed to the full script.
Hate that shit.
Really?
Hate it. I hate the Marvel style. I like working from the full script, even if I disagree entirely with what's being said in the script. I like having a script that I can at least, you know, respond to. The Marvel style tends to be lazy and presumes too much on me. I like a full script. One of the reasons I left DC to go to Marvel was I was working with a writer who was giving me Marvel style stuff, and I just hated it. I believe that pagination is one of the responsibilities of the writer, and controlling the narrative and controlling the pacing of the narrative is the writer's responsibility.
Wonderful.
Okay?
Thank you, Howard.
Thanks you all. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for your attention. Hopefully we'll see some of you in a week. And Chuck, thanks for being such a fabulous host.
Absolutely. Well, thanks you all for
That's
being
all. Thank
here.
Chuck.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Please.
Chuck,
Howard, what do you say about attention for affection?
I'm always willing to mistake attention for affection. It's a byword for the world.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Everybody have
thanks
a
lot,
wonderful
guys.
weekend. Head on back to the website and you can get all the dates for the future.
Thanks,
talks.
Chuck.
Be there. We'll see you on campus sooner or later. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, Howard. Have a good weekend. Bye.